Welcome to Accountable, where your business is our business. Hosted by David R. Peters. Today's guest is Allie Feakins.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Accountable, the podcast for CFOs by a CFO. My name's David Peters. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. I have to tell you that there's certain topics that we discuss that I get really jazzed up about. And I have to tell you, this is sort of a nerdy, guilty pleasure of mine. Today is all about data, and more specifically, it's about data analytics. It's about how can we take the data that we have and use that to give us a competitive advantage. And I think that our guest today is an outstanding person to talk about data. She is Allie Feakins. Allie Feakins is our guest today. She's the CEO of Compare.com. Compare.com is a price comparison website, sort of like Kayak for auto insurance rates. And Allie has been in the insurance industry for a while. Before she took over as CEO of Compare, she worked as the head of analytics there for about 3.5 years. Before that, she was a product manager at Progressive. And one of the things that I will tell you is that if you're going to be working in the insurance space, it's all about getting that leg up on your competition. That's really what it's all about. It's how can I better understand the risk that I'm writing? And so it's all about analytics. And so I think that Allie's a great person to talk to about this. How can we make an effective analytics dashboard? How can we develop KPIs? How can we do this in the best way possible? So I think Allie's a great person to talk about this. Again, this is one of my guilty pleasures because I think that a lot of you out there, when I'm out and I'm talking with people, this is something that we struggle with. We as CFOs, we are good with the dollars end of things, but maybe not as much with analyzing operational data. And I think that Allie does a great job of talking all about that. So enjoy my conversation with Allie Feakins. All right. Well, so here with me on this episode of Accountable is Allie Feakins. Allie is the CEO of Compare.com. Hi, Allie. Thank you for being on Accountable.
Hi, Dave. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. So today we're going to talk a little bit about metrics, which is a thing that is near and dear to your heart. It's near and dear to my heart too. This is something though that I got to tell you that I think a lot of CFOs, a lot of controllers that they struggle with. I mean, because we know a lot of accounting stuff, but when it comes to when we get into the executive positions, we get into the leadership positions of the company, I'm not sure that all of us really have training in that area. I mean, I think that this is maybe something that's a little bit new. I don't know how you felt. I mean, when you were starting to step up into leadership roles, I mean, was metrics something that was kind of new to you?
It was, I think, something that's been ingrained in me for a long time.
Okay.
My first career, if you will, I was an HR consultant. So I spent a lot of time designing incentive compensation programs, which taught me about metrics and KPIs because people were getting paid on them. And then my role before I became CEO here, I was the head of analytics for 4 years. So I spent all of my time thinking about how we measure, how we use the data to improve performance. So it's always been part of my DNA. But sometimes it takes a little bit of time to incorporate, especially when they're changing. When the business is changing, it's important to dig back in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's well said. Now, one of the things I thought that was kind of interesting there, and this is something I have to tell you, I just came off of a conference where I had somebody who made a really big deal about this, the difference between metrics and KPIs. KPIs, key performance indicators versus metrics. Is this just semantics or is there really a difference? I mean, what would you say? What's kind of the difference between those two?
Yeah, I think there is a difference because your KPIs really need to be tightly tied to your strategy and what you're trying to achieve, and you need to set targets around those. Whereas metrics, I mean, we have so many dashboards with metrics galore on them, and you cannot improve every metric at once. Like you squeeze the balloon, and if you try to improve them all at once, you're probably going to fail and not meet your overall objective and achieve your strategy. So I like to think of those KPIs as those are the emails or the checks that I do every day to see it's a scorecard. Am I making progress? And then the other metrics and support are really clues as to how I can develop new processes, new products, like different plans to ultimately improve the KPIs. And those are what matter more.
So KPIs, it sounds like, are a lot more strategic. I think that's what I'm hearing you say is that KPIs are kind of your big time, high level strategy, whereas metrics are kind of day to day indicators. I mean, is that fair?
That's how I use them. That's how we use them in our business. And so I do care when a metric and error rate goes crazy, but I don't spend all of the time obsessing about the error rate because it usually doesn't move.
Yeah. Okay. So, and just for context for everybody, so compare.com, a website, auto insurance, price comparison. So very similar idea to kayak for auto insurance comparison. And so one of the things that we're really concerned with, I think, especially is error rates and maybe situations where somebody doesn't make it all the way through the website, those types of things.
Yeah, that's one of the more operational metrics. So we have our traditional marketing metrics, our acquisition economics that we're looking at, our volumes. We have the actual website performance. We have error rate speeds, things like that. And then we sell auto insurance, so we care significantly about our partners' performance as well. So we have different cadences for all those measurements, and pulling those together into a meaningful KPI makes a big difference because not all of the information is available real time. So they take some work.
Yeah, so I think that that's a great point because I think a lot of our folks, especially if they've never actually built out a metrics dashboard, they don't even really know how to start. I mean, and I think that I think that our listeners would be curious: how exactly do you go about building out a dashboard, especially when you're first walking into somewhere where you really just don't have metrics, you don't have KPIs. So what do you do? How do you begin?
Yeah, yeah. Well, absolutely start with what's your strategy? What's the big picture? What are your priorities? And simplify it as much as you can. And then you need to have a pretty good gap analysis of what data is available when. So I kind of think about a matrix in my head. I know that my spend data is available 24 hours later, but I know my revenue data is only available once a month. So there are just going to be some KPIs that aren't going to be perfect until you close the books. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But one of the things that I do to bridge the gap and make decisions more real time is to develop dashboards that track some metrics and some development over time, and then use
Okay.
those to project how I'm doing. So on the 15th of every month, I can take a read on revenue or whatever the downstream metric is. And I know what's normal and what's not because I know how it develops over time. It's kind of a nerdy insurance concept of development triangles, but it's
Right.
really
Sure.
helpful when you have information that's not all coming in at the same rate.
Yeah, so basically, and you used an insurance industry term, and just so folks that know about this idea, so a development triangle, basically that's going to take your history over time, and basically you're sort of making this assumption that history is going to repeat itself. Is that fair, at least in broad strokes?
Absolutely. So, yeah. So, how are things on the first week of the month? How did they develop to the second? What new information was available? And things usually develop at a similar rate. So, it's a helpful way to kind of benchmark against your own history.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, as much as a lot of us would maybe hate to admit it, history does tend to repeat itself, and I think especially in the insurance industry, we've kind of almost made an industry of it. I think so. Um, So one other thing I think that folks are maybe a little bit baffled by is, especially us financial people, we spend a lot of time in finance classes, so we can handle liquidity ratios and those types of things. We're good there. But I think the operational metrics, I think, are the ones that I get asked about a lot when I'm speaking at conferences and things like that. Are there any operational metrics that, you can point to and say, you know what, hey, these are some things that I think a lot of people would find relevant? Because I think, or is it just different from one company to the next?
Yeah, I think that it does vary from company to company, but the real key is understanding those value drivers, for lack of a
Right.
better term. So, what are the events, the interaction with consumers that create value, or suppliers that create value, and how they're correlated. So for me, so I have people visiting my website, and they can take different kinds of actions for which I may get paid, right? And they're not all the same, and they're not all equal. So an example of this kind of falling apart is just I saw a first pass of a budget a couple of years ago where we're projecting growth, like, hey, like we're going to grow at a 5%, 10% rate, whatever it was. But the actual revenue growth projections weren't tied to the underlying metrics, and it looked
Okay.
like unit revenue was getting worse every year. It's like, why would that be the case? So having a good understanding of what happens in the real world that creates the money, and making sure that those relationships hold over time are good, is a good thing to do. So I imagine a lot of these metrics and KPIs and changes to them, like in curves, where there's usually there's a point. If I spend twice as much money, I don't get twice as much volume. If I sell
Right.
twice as much stuff, there's at a discount, I might not get twice as much revenue, or it depends on the source. So having a map in your head of value and how it's created in that business can then help you tie it to those cost and revenue projections, and ultimately project your margins and how you're going to grow profitably. So how I
What?
approach.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, and I think that's very well said. One of the things that I have heard before, whenever I've been in conferences and heard people talk about metrics and kind of how to build out dashboards, is really kind of getting a solid understanding, because a lot of businesses, they don't have a ton of revenue drivers. I mean, most of the time, I mean, if you can think about it, if you can sort of visualize it in your head, there's a few that really drive the business. I mean, yeah, there's other stuff around that, but for the most part, there's a few that sort of drive the business. Is that fair? Would you agree with that?
For ours, there are there are clear priorities, the most important ones, and so there's the triggers are few and far between, but the influencers along the way can really vary. So I can make a change to my consumer's journey that might I'll get them further deeper in, but then there's a problem and it drops off. So it's this kind of squeeze the balloon concept. For actually impacting how many triggers do I get? And I think it goes back to those curves. Very few relationships are a straight line. So
Right.
you have different thresholds. And as you're thinking about your business and thinking about your strategic plan, you might have, okay, I'm gonna have a really high growth area here. And this is the expected efficiency or throughput in that mode versus
Right.
the other one. Or if I open up a new channel. So when we opened up our B2B channel, the margin on that business might be different than the margin when we go direct to the consumer. And so how will that scale and change my business over time? And so our KPIs are high level KPIs. Some
Right.
may look like they're getting, like, throughput might look worse, when in reality we introduce new complexity to the business, and we're okay because we're tied to that strategic objective of growing and scaling. And that works for us.
Imagine that, folks. All you listeners out there, business changes. Who would have ever thought, especially right now in 2020, right?
I know.
Uh,
So always
I mean,
prepared.
always prepared, right? So let me ask you this then. So so it sounds to me like we need to be constantly sort of changing and sort of updating our metrics, because those relationships are going to change. I mean, is that kind of what I'm hearing you saying, is that they kind of need to evolve over time? Or is there like a few key ones that are just like, these are the ones that we really want to look at, kind of from one period to the next till the end of time?
Yeah, I think your core KPIs, when they're aligned with your planning and your business planning cycle, those aren't going to change a heck of a lot. And it's actually a little bit dangerous to change those because your people get confused. They're not sure what priority, what we always use the word priorities, but there should be like a priority, like which one that they should
Right.
be about, right? So changing those is dangerous just from an employee communication perspective. So you want to keep those relatively consistent. What I tend to do, so I'll look at those, their consistent metric, daily, monthly, whatever. But the underlying metrics, I look at those less often, but they're the ones with all the volatility in the movement, right? So I'll do a deep dive at the end of a month and be like, okay, conversion is trending up. Why? And what are the drivers and what are the opportunities there? So what I look at changes every month, but I try to keep the outcomes, the measures of success as consistent as I can so people stay focused.
I think that's a great point. Because one of the reasons why we put together metrics and the reason why we have KPIs is because it gives us targets. I mean, and I think that's kind of I think that's what I'm hearing you say is that KPIs kind of give us targets, and if you confuse the target, so if you're telling staff members, the folks that are supporting you in your role, this is what we're shooting for, and then you change how you measure that, or you don't measure it at all, well, then all of a sudden it's just like they struggle to sort of reconcile those things. I mean, is that fair?
Absolutely, and they want to know if we've done it. If we've done well. If they want to know if they've done a good job contributing at the end of the day. And one of the fastest ways to kind of lose engagement from your employees is when they think they're doing all the right things, and at the end, instead of getting a good job, you hit the KPI. They get a but what about this, which wasn't
Right.
KPI.
Right.
So you need to evolve over time, but you need to be careful about how it influences people how you when you change the yardstick. But getting that yardstick commonly agreed upon at the beginning of the year and how we're going to measure you and how we're going to reward you is really important. And try to keep it aligned. Mhm.
So, I mean, do you build metrics for like different levels within the company? I mean, is that, so we have like maybe I've heard some CFOs tell me that where they'll say, okay, I build metrics for, different parts of the company. And my staff has metrics, then my sort of my middle managers kind of have metrics, and then I have sort of like an executive metrics dashboard, for lack of a better term. Is that how we should be building things, or is it? I mean, do you have a preference there, or how do you do it?
I think that's pretty common. So we're a relatively small organization, but we do have differences. So, but it tends to kind of cascade down, if you will. So we're still driving at, growth, revenue, those kinds of things. But when I look at like our IT organization has completely different dashboards, and um, they're not built for me, and that's okay.
Right.
I am okay with that, but they are built to measure the things that'll ultimately hit our quote volume, our customer volume, which will ultimately hit our revenue. So it needs to line up and be consistent, but they have to be different. You can't use the same tool to measure every part of your business. So we have a handful, but knowing what to use when, what's in your toolkit, and what to use when, and try to only have one tool for each purpose so that you don't have conflicting ones. That helps a lot. So
Yeah, so I think that maybe, and I think that's a great comment, because I think that, a lot of times when we're building out metrics and things like that, I think what I've heard from some folks is that they struggle with this idea that they're not building the metrics for the financial folks. They're building it a lot of times for the end user. It's not really about what they internalize, it's about what the company is going to internalize. And I know, like, for me personally, I mean, I'll talk for myself here, but for me personally, I mean, that was a lesson for me. I mean, that was something that that I needed to kind of internalize, and I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that that's something that I think a lot of people. I think we just naturally. Probably wrongfully, we assume that everybody thinks like us.
yeah, yeah, no, it is really as we're building dashboards out. So when I was the head of analytics here
Yeah.
and building dashboards for marketing versus the customer journey group versus the carrier group, the partnership group, they all literally have different definitions of of an interaction. So it really helps to sit with them and see what they're working with and what the limitations are on some of their information. So you don't go, you can't, sometimes you can't change the nature of the data that you're working with. So one of our board members used to want every metric cut 6 ways to Sunday, by
Right.
state, by consumer profile, by all these things.
Right.
Really do that. The data doesn't exist at that granularity. So the only way to learn that is to sit with the different groups and understand the tools they have available. And then you can have a conversation of, is this the right tool or the right data collection method to achieve the business purpose? Or, how much more does it cost? Is it worth it? Oh, it's not worth it. That's just so-and-so's, like, I like to ask once a quarter just out of curiosity question and not aligned with a KPI. So that way you don't waste too much time or overspend on monitoring tool that you never actually use, or you use once a month to make your board member happy. And I love happy board members, but happy board members like it when we make money, not when we answer their questions super fast every time. So
Well put.
So
Yeah. No, I think that that's well put. And I think that and I think a lot of financial leaders and I think a lot of business folks in general, they're pleasers, right? They're pleasers. They're trying to please, the stakeholders and things like that. That's partly,
we follow.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, that's part of what you get paid to do. But there's also, if it's one person that's asking for one thing, every now and again, not sure that that's really necessarily, worth changing your entire operations around and things like that. I think there's got to be cost benefit there. I also like what you said there too, really understanding the inputs and the limitations of the data that you're actually getting in. I think that's important as well. We had a guest on the show, Patsy Daniels, who I know that you know very well. One of the things that Patsy was talking about is just really trying to understand the definition and making sure that the end users really understand the definition of what is going into the data warehouse. We were talking about within the context of data warehousing and understanding those limitations of that definition so that, you can actually form in your brain what exactly should be coming out as data there and what you are seeing, I think is because I think we make a lot of assumptions into the data. Is that...
I think we do make we make a lot of assumptions, but I do think when you're looking at a data set or looking at your results that you should always go in with a hypothesis and
Right.
be testing it, right? It's like, why is this true, or what would make this true? Or that kind of questioning is really good. But you need to know what the basic definition of your metric is. And that gets even more dangerous when you start to look at your business against your competitors and how they view themselves. Because it's really
Right.
easy to say, hey, I have 1 million users. And what did that user do? Did that user just bounce off my website, or did that user
Right.
pay and buy something? Like, what is that look like? So there are some definitions. I happen to work in insurance, right? So
Yeah.
there are some industries that are highly regulated and really mature where, a loss ratio is a loss ratio is a loss ratio, and you can benchmark that, right? So very clear stuff. And within finance, very, like you said at the beginning, very clear ratios that are well understood.
Sure.
But in the operational world, it's not the same. Like, everybody's using a different bar. So you just got to be a little bit careful and be aware you might change your own internal metrics over time for good reasons. Our business has changed. It is different. From now on, a quote will be ABC definition and not XYZ, like, because different business.
Mhm.
You have to be aware of that so you can explain it and really make better decisions for the future. That's what it's about. So yeah.
I think that's important too. Just for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with this, it's sort of like the equivalent of looking at a current ratio versus a quick ratio versus a cash ratio. They all kind of measure liquidity, but they all do it in very different ways. And oftentimes, a lot of times what you'll see is if you move from one firm to another firm, you still see differences. And that's true in the insurance world. I can certainly vouch for that one. I also would say, though, too, it's true in a lot of other industries industries too, where they call it the same thing, but if you really look into what goes into that metric, it's actually a little bit different. And so being aware of kind of some of those inconsistencies, I guess, I think is probably important. I mean, I think that's what I'm hearing you say.
I think that's true. And when you jump into a new business and really diving in and understanding the basis of all those metrics is pretty important, right? And if you need to rebaseline, you rebaseline and figure out, we're going to call an apple or whatever that might be, again, so that you can know what's going to move your KPIs forward. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Now, one of the things that I think that you were just mentioning is you're talking about how other companies kind of measure things. Do you do any sort of benchmarking or anything like that? I mean, because especially like for you, you're in a specialized area. I mean, I mean, how many price comparison websites are there out there, guys? I mean, there's not a ton, right? I mean, there's some, but there's not a ton. Do you do any sort of benchmarking or anything like that?
Yeah, we use it. We don't use it necessarily to judge if we're doing well or not, because our business models are different. But it's good to know what's happening over time, what the trends are. So we'll monitor, industry shopping. We'll monitor visitor growth or lack thereof amongst our competitors, and try to get a feel for that. The cadence of that, though, compared to our internal, is more, it's a quarterly update kind of thing. And it's good to keep tabs. Some of the investment banks out there, they will benchmark more aggressively some metrics to say, hey, this is normal conversion for a lead versus different types of leads, a call versus lead or whatever. And I take those with a grain of salt, because we still need to do the things that are our own business drivers as priority. But it might give us some ideas if there are big gaps. So it might give us inspiration for, again, a new process or a new product that might be a game changer for us. So they're informative, but I try not to judge if we're good or bad from them.
I think I think that's a good point. I mean, I think one of the things that I think you're particularly good at is sort of using the information that you have to make connections, and I think that's another thing that I think a lot of us a lot of us on the finance side, and I don't think I'm going out on a limb here. We're pretty perfectionistic just by wiring. I think we like it to be right, and I think especially when it comes to data, it's just not always possible to sort of get data as much as you want. Some highly regulated industries, I think especially the highly regulated industries, they tend to have more information available because it's available to the public. But even if you don't have perfect information, I mean, I think there's still something that can be gleaned from the information that you have, because I get asked about benchmarking a lot. I mean, I'll be honest, people want to know, how do you do it?
Yeah, no, and it's an important, just you talked about sort of as you get into the executive suite, like just the competency of general market scanning and knowing what's happening is really important. But you're usually triangulating because
Yeah.
everyone's coming at it from a different perspective. So it's important to keep that information coming in, keep tabs on what's happening in your industry, the trends that are happening there. And the other, I mean, and you can read articles to stay up to date, but a lot of the big benchmark studies are old, man. Like
Right.
the time they're published, they're already 4 or 5 months old, and the data's old. So things like COVID's messed all of the benchmarks up. So you just got to be careful how you use them, and figure out as an executive how you are going to stay up to speed in your space. And it might be a trickle of information and benchmarks instead of a big comprehensive study that you can cut 10 ways. And that's okay. That's still better than having a blind spot.
And there does tend to be a pretty good lag. I mean, because there's always kind of this trade-off, right? If you get real-time data, it's usually pretty dirty data. I mean, it's usually not, real cleaned up, and maybe not necessarily even really reliable. However, if you wait, well, then you got the problem with waiting, right? I mean,
Perfect, but old. So,
but old, and so a lot of times when you're looking at benchmarking studies and that kind of stuff, I think to your point is that it tends to lag because they're waiting for perfect data, and so there is that sort of aspect as well. And I think for a lot of our listeners, that's the trade-off. It's time versus reliability, I guess.
yeah, and just you guys, your businesses. So how do you interpret that? Like, how do you get that into your planning process? And I think, again, I use it for the future rather than judging my past when I'm looking at benchmarks. So
Yeah. Yeah. Now, let me ask you one other thing, because I think that this is, we're kind of in an interesting time where we are starting to become more and more aware of kind of all of the data that's around us. I mean, it seems like everywhere you go, it's like every time we used to read newspapers. I don't think anybody, I don't know if people read the newspaper or not. But anyway, yeah, maybe on Sunday. I don't know, but anyway, but we used to have, in the business section, it seems like every day it's talking about companies using sort of this full range of data, kind of not just internal data anymore that I'm generating from my systems, but also kind of data that's sort of outside of me. So social media tends to be the one that we kind of stereotypically kind of turn to with that. But it's not just that. I mean, it's economic data and stuff like that too. I mean, is there a place in a metrics dashboard for stuff like that, or does it just kind of vary by the industry? Or I mean, where do you fall on that?
yeah, I mean, I think that the third party data is overwhelming. So you need to make sure whichever bit you're tracking is valuable and related to the goals that you have. And I actually, the more you incorporate third party data into your business, it actually it increases your risk as well and your exposure.
Right.
So you're bringing in data. You don't know if you're matching it up right. Sometimes you're bringing in customer data, and there's security issues and concerns around that I'm sure a lot of CFOs also have on their plates, right? So
Yep.
you really just need to make sure that the data is going to be worth it, have a positive ROI, have a holistic perspective, and that you can trust it. But we are in a connected world. We can plug into APIs and pull in almost anything. I talked to someone yesterday, and if I have a customer on a cell phone on the cellular network with 95% accuracy, just from them being on my website, they could look up and pull in that customer's information, like a full profile. It's insane.
Wow.
So just the data's there. You just have to have a really killer use case for it before you just pile it all in. I don't, collecting it for its own sake just means you have to pay to store it and analyze it, and it can get messy. So I'm a little bit cautious about some of that. I guess more selective, I guess is how I should say it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but I think that's true. I mean, there is such a thing as like information overload, and the more academic-y term is what is it, analysis paralysis or something like that. I think I've heard that somewhere in some paper somewhere. But I mean, the fact is that I do think it becomes overwhelming. I think a lot of times we see, whenever I'm attending conferences and they're talking about data, people are like, "Well, how do I get on board this, this data train?" And really, it's not about what is out there most of the time. Most of the time, it's about what do you need, what does your business need, and what is going to really propel your business forward.
Yeah, definitely from a use case. What do you need? What propels you forward? From if I put my CFO hat on too, like data governance is huge.
Yes.
Too. So y'all have in the finance world so many controls in place. Like we just talked about being rule followers. The data world is just all cowboys, man. So you don't really always know if a source that you're acquiring, maybe your marketing department wants to use this for this awesome killer case. It might not be legal, man. So you've got to be a little bit careful for what are you curating from a data. I call it curation more than collection, because you gotta know what it is, how you're allowed to use it, what controls need to be around it. And it's actually a good pairing, I think, with the financial world, to have your data team tightly aligned there, because it's a good mindset to have around governance.
And just for the folks that are out there, so data governance, you can almost sort of think about it as sort of like house rules when it comes to data, almost. So it's sort of like anything and everything having to do with data, how data is stored, how data, definitions of data, kind of how when do we change data versus when do we not change data. So I would sort of describe it as house rules for data. I don't know if that's how you would describe it as well. I don't know if that's a fair definition.
I think that's fair. Absolutely. And it's an important process that's newer, right? So because data has just exploded. So
Yeah.
it's important to keep it under control too. So
Yeah. I mean, so Allie, any other rules of thumb or thoughts for folks that are trying to do this for their organization? I mean, I feel like we just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, we haven't even really we talked about sort of some of the theoretical stuff, but when it comes to how, I mean, consistent delivery of data in the right format with the right tools, and then the number of tools out there is quite overwhelming nowadays. So that's a different process, but being consistent is probably the most important thing. So making sure people when they pull down a number that it matches no matter which system it's coming from, trying to guide people through that is another animal as well that's worth thinking through as you develop out your dashboards and your metrics. So you do not want a dashboard in the marketing department and the finance department where the spend numbers don't match, and that happens in many organizations. So you need a leader to drive that to be consistent. So
And that's where your data governance, I think, can really help you out. Is because again, if you're all sort of following the same set of rules, hopefully that's better. I mean, I'm not saying that there's never going to be discrepancies. I mean, people are people, and you know the.
but you want the best info available to make your decisions and to have your and be able to push decision making to the front lines. If that's part of your culture, then you just need to get the information in the right hands, and it needs to be information they can trust. So that's kind of what it all comes back to. So
Very well said. Well, hey, Allie, thank you so much for being on the show today. I think that this is one of those things I think a lot of CFOs are really struggling with, because all of a sudden, this data world has seemed to like explode in front of our eyes. And so I think any guidance and help, I think is appreciated there for sure.
yeah, absolutely. No, I'm happy to help out. It's an exciting time. So good luck to everybody.
Yeah, there you go, folks. So, Allie, thanks so much for being on Accountable.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Accountable. Be sure to subscribe for more interviews and insights from today's business leaders. David Peters is a registered representative offering securities through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered through Carroll Financial Associates, a registered investment advisor. Peters Tax Preparation, David Peters Financial, Carroll Financial, and Cetera Advisor Networks are not affiliated. He is located at 1657 West Broad Street, Unit 5, Richmond, Virginia, 23220, and can be reached at 804-332-1373. The views depicted in this material are for information purposes only and not necessarily those of Cetera. They should not be considered specific advice or recommendations for any individual.